Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Simon Talks Music. My name is Simon and I talk about music. Today I'm doing 8 mini album reviews. It's the 6th of these mini review videos for 2026 where I talk about albums in short form reviews, give my personal opinions on them. Again, it's just what I think of these albums. Feel free to disagree with me. These are not objective decisions on whether or not these albums are good or bad. Again, it's just my personal opinion, so feel free to disagree with me. Music is completely subjective at the end of the day. Just before I get into the reviews, though, I do just want to say one quick thing. I am sick right now, so my voice doesn't sound great. If it sounds a little bit different, now you know why. I was considering just waiting until I was feeling better to film this, but I thought, you know what, I want to get this video out sooner rather than later, so I may as well film it right now. I mean, I'm just at home doing nothing, so why not film this video that I had written already, you know? Anyway, I've got 8 albums to talk about today, and we're going to start with... I watched the Needle Drops review of this album from a pretty obscure post-punk band, although I'm sure after that review they're probably going to get a lot more attention. And this is the debut studio album from this band whom I never heard of before. I do really like post-punk, so I thought I'd give it a shot, especially considering that Fantano liked it in his review. And okay, the first thing I'll mention is that I could not find lyrics posted anywhere for this album, and while they are pretty easy for me to hear, the honest truth is I have a bad attention span, and when they're not written out in front of me, it's a lot harder for me to find my own interpretations in them. Which might be unfair, but it's as honest as I can be. And musically speaking, well, yeah, I see the hype with this. Honestly, I'm reminded quite a bit of when Squid put out their debut album in 2021, in the way that this feels like an exciting new post-punk / krautrock band whose approach to this style feels unique to them, and I'm absolutely excited to hear whatever they do next. But on the topic of this album, look, I'd be lying if I said I was fully won over already, because this album does very much feel like a debut album. It's a bit repetitive at times, in ways that don't always suit the album, and some of these tracks suffer from style over substance, if you ask me. Not a huge complaint, though, when it's so damn fun and groovy. And yeah, I'm happy to say that this is a really strong first impression. The first song here that had me really pumped about this during my listening process was Darling. By far the longest song here, running for 12 minutes, and with a bit more creativity and experimentation, this could have been a masterpiece. As it is, it's still a really fun song, and I also really love the bass line on There's a Garden in You. And while I don't think the vocals are super unique for post-punk, Quinn Robinson absolutely brings enough energy behind the mic to drive these songs home. And again, I'm very excited to hear whatever's next for this band. Strong 7 out of 10, and I'd say it's pretty close to being great. I'd recommend giving this a shot. Alright, so I've got to mention that I'm not the biggest fan of Joji. I'm not super familiar with all of his music, but I did listen to all of his albums recently. Well, all his albums as Joji. And look, as much as I really like Daylight as a highlight from 2020's Nectar, his 2018 single, Slow Dancing in the Dark, which so many people went absolutely nuts over, is really only decent in my opinion, and Glimpse of Us has really cooled on me a lot since its release in 2022. It's a good song, but I'm not really sure what I heard in it at the time that made me call it the second best hit song of that year, and that 2022 album also has not gotten any better. And I was worried when I saw that this had even worse ratings than Smithereens from 2022, so I did not set my expectations too high. And what's interesting is that this album is 21 songs long and still only runs barely over 45 minutes. There's literally only one song on this album that runs over 3 minutes, and that's Love You Less, which honestly sounds like a wannabe of End of Beginning by Joe. Funny that Yeet actually says End to Beginning on Rose Colored later on this album. And honestly, this album doesn't really feel complete. It's got the same problem that Smithereens did, feeling more like an album full of partial songs that mostly don't feel finished. And sometimes that can lead to some rough vocal effects, weird percussion choices that don't fit at all, or other strange aspects of the sound and production. And that's not even mentioning the writing. Again, throughout the majority of this album, it feels like there's barely anything here. But if I'm trying to find things about the album that work, well, I like that Giveon collab with its smooth production and good vocals from both singers, and the message of moving on from a relationship that isn't serving them any good. Past Won't Leave My Bed also at least sounds a little bit more like a regular song, and not a bad one. The production was pretty solid on that one, and I actually don't really mind the Yeet collab, mostly due to the pretty good instrumental production. The vocal effects on that song are kind of weird though. So yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, considering it's mostly just an album of fragments without feeling like full songs. And funny enough, there's a song on this album called Fragments. And that's never been something that I think Joji's been good at, if you ask me. And lyrically, it just feels like he's repeating himself here about some past relationship that keeps haunting him, not new lyrical territory for him. And while I don't think it's a bad concept, there's barely anything here that I found interesting. And it just feels like it's the same idea over and over again of, oh, I keep seeing you everywhere I go. And honestly, after a while, it just becomes depressing and starts to really test my patience. And there's just barely anything good I can say about it. So yeah, for me, it's a strong 3 out of 10. And honestly, I don't think these individual moments are all horrible. Some of them are pretty goddamn obnoxious, though. It's just that when you put it all together, I'm left wondering, what is even the appeal of this? But whatever, maybe you'll hear something in it that I don't. But if I want this kind of fragmented, gloomy experimental pop, I'll just listen to Saya Gray instead. Another artist I've never been a huge fan of, but compared to this, yeah, this new Joji album really did not work for me at all. In fact, I think it's really bad. This is the second studio album from this black metal duo from Italy, and their first in over a decade. And this has been getting quite a bit of critical acclaim, so I thought I'd check it out, although I have not listened to their debut yet. And I will mention most of the lyrics are in Italian, so it's hard for me to properly give full opinions on them, even though I did look at translations, because I'm not sure how accurate the translations are. Although when I looked at the lyrics in English, a lot of them were pretty specific, using a lot of big words, so it might be mostly accurate. I used Google Translate to translate the lyrics. And I'll admit, I do have a bit of a hard time following along with the lyrics, considering how much of it seems to be covered up in metaphors. Although I do kind of wonder if it's about the fear of a bleak future. I don't know, it's hard to tell, and sometimes this does feel a little bit backward looking in its commentary, although it might also be satirical, and I just struggle to fully understand what the messaging of it is. But when it comes to the music itself, well, it is a pretty punishing black metal album, where the horrifying vibes are definitely attempted, and sometimes pulled off quite well. Although I don't always love the production and the way it makes this sound less punchy and more moody, which doesn't always fit with the instrumentation. I think some of the riffs and heavy chaos of Cryptæ leads to quite possibly my favorite track here, and there are other strong moments like the following Angor, which also features some excellent guitar work, but I just wasn't super wowed by this album as a whole. Take what I'm saying about the lyrics with a grain of salt, because I really don't know what this album's actually about, but some parts of it kind of rubbed me the wrong way, although I've certainly heard much worse. And the production is quite hit or miss. Still mostly solid though, with some pretty impressive instrumentation. I'm just probably not going back to it. Light 7 out of 10. Alright, so I've mentioned many times that I'm not much of a death metal fan. I often find the genre overly chaotic, with more emphasis on being as heavy as possible without really having that much to offer beyond that. But there are exceptions, so I decided to give this new critically acclaimed death metal album a chance, and no surprise, it's not for me at all. In fact, even by my standards of death metal, I'd probably call this underwhelming, even for me, as I just hear a bunch of endless lyrics about killing people with very graphic detail. And yes, I understand it's very common themes for death metal, and it's not actually promoting these kinds of behaviors. Maybe it's more a way to experience some weird fantasies in a fictional context, and I can respect that, but it doesn't mean I really enjoy listening to it. Honestly, it's one of the things that's made a lot of death metal so off-putting for me in general. Although on this album, I can acknowledge my appreciation of the more introspective lyrics on Symphony of Absurdity, even though I think the music suffers from the same issue that the vast majority of this album does, if not worse. And on that note, the main issue here is that beyond some good riffs on songs like Nauseating Composition, and let me try and pronounce this correctly, Sonoluminescent Hemoglobinopathy, the latter of which might be the best track here, as it's the kind of death metal that takes each instrument, including vocals, and brings it all together to sound like a more well thought out piece of music, although I'm probably not going to remember this track. What does this album have to offer musically, beyond those few examples I just gave? It sounds like the most generic, uninteresting death metal album you could imagine. And while I've certainly heard worse metal vocalists than Bridget Lynch, and I can at least acknowledge her vocals are impressive, it's just not a vocal style I'm really a fan of. I guess she exceeds expectations in that regard slightly. So yeah, for me, this is a light 5 out of 10, and really not something I'd recommend to anyone unless you're a death metal fan. And even then, you might be disappointed. I know I certainly was. But hey, death metal's not my genre, so maybe I should not have the final say. Alright, so here's a prog rock band from Sweden whom I'd never heard of before this, and they have a few albums which got a decent amount of critical acclaim, as is the case with this new one. Although I just skipped over those ones for time reasons and decided to check out this new album. And when I saw that this album is under 45 minutes, I certainly was not expecting a more than 20-minute opening track. But that's what we got, and it seems to set up a bunch of this album's potential themes. And while I'm not going to pretend I could totally follow along, part of me feels like it kind of represents someone having some kind of existential crisis, which describes a bunch of topics in more detail. And while the song takes a while to get going, I did really like the ending of it, and it leads into Face of an Angel, which I think is a pretty solid melodic tune, even though I'm probably not going to be returning to it much, if at all. And honestly, that's kind of my feelings on the album. It's a decent prog rock album, but not with a lot of moments that really make it stand out to me in the grander scheme of things. And I'm often just sitting here waiting for something really exciting and huge to happen. And for the majority of this album, it doesn't. And whenever it does, it usually just feels like it's surrounded by filler. I just don't find the vocals particularly captivating, the production is kind of shaky throughout the album, and again, I feel like it just isn't hitting as hard as it should. So for me, it's a 6 out of 10, not a bad album by any means. I did have a hard time following along with the lyrics, maybe partially from not spending a ton of time analyzing them. But still, it's hard for me to comment on the lyrics, especially when the emphasis here seems to be on the musical journey throughout. But I think it's underwhelming. Really unfortunate to say, I don't think it lives up to the hype. So I was gonna review that Jonas Brothers album last year, which absolutely sucked, but I eventually realized that I had better things to do with my time. And that was a crazy year for me, where I was not really committed to this YouTube channel as much as I would have liked to be. But anyway, it's 2026, and I'm trying to review more albums, and while I'm not a big fan of most of the Nick Jonas songs I've heard, and I've never listened to a full album of his, and I'm not that big a fan of the Jonas Brothers either, I decided why not give this a shot? And wow, who would have guessed? It's not very good. And honestly, considering my time crunch as someone who has a job and is currently going to college, and is also hoping to work on multiple individual album reviews as well as all the other mini reviews in this video, and I also have a life outside of all of this, I think it's best I keep this one brief. I mean, that's what I've been doing for most of the album reviews in this video. Because yeah, why waste a bunch of time trying to do a proper review for this really mediocre pop album? Actually, to Nick Jonas's credit, as cliche as a lot of the lyrical sentiments are, there are some clever lines here and there, and for this kind of pop music, the writing is above average, considering a lot of this feels like it's designed to be radio filler. And his vocals are not half bad either. It's just a shame that so many of the instrumentals and compositions sound so basic to me. And that's ignoring Hope, which is a blatant wannabe attempt of Teddy Swim's Lose Control, a song I've never been a huge fan of, but I'll take it over this. Gut Punch is by far the best song on this album, and that's just because I'm a sucker for this kind of ear candy pop tune, with the attempts at being anthemic that are mostly pulled off with strong melodies and an emotional sentiment that doesn't try too hard to be more than it is. It's a difficult formula to describe, but my point being that to the average listener, this is probably going to be just another bland pop song. I personally kind of love it. But then you get the awkward, jumpy instrumentation of Seeing Ghosts, the depressing sound of I Need You, which is about the last thing I think this song was aiming for, and so many other bland moments that are very inessential listening, and I genuinely find this album to be mostly a slog to get through. I think some of the melodramatic moments are kinda saved by his vocals, which can sell it, but this album is still getting a 5 out of 10 from me, and I can't really recommend it unless you're a huge fan of Nick Jonas and or the Jonas Brothers, in which case you've probably already heard it. For me, well, it's fine, I guess, but even the Jonas Brothers had better albums than this. Their early stuff, not post-comeback. Their post-comeback Jonas Brothers albums are terrible. And they actually appear on this album on The Greatest, which is probably one of the better songs here, but they've still done much better, and that's coming from a non-fan. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. The album's mediocre. I finally decided to listen to every previous Silversun Pickups album multiple times each, as someone who's heard of this band a lot but never actually taken the time to properly listen to them. Really, I hadn't listened to them at all outside of maybe a song or two here and there, although I could not have named one until recently. And while their 2006 debut probably got the most acclaim of any of their albums and featured the 2000s alt-rock classic Lazy Eye, my favorite Silversun Pickups album has got to be a toss-up between that album and 2015's Better Nature, probably going to the latter for its endless good melodies and solid production if I had to pick one. Although even that album I wouldn't quite call great, even though it is really damn close. But with their two most recent albums being quite disappointing, I didn't have super high expectations for this. And yeah, I just wish there were more strong melodies here, or real energy that didn't feel held back by the production, or really just anything to make this album memorable. Because while I did only listen to this 3 times, I think that was enough, because it almost feels like I'm just listening to the same song over and over again. And yeah, if I listened to this more, I'd probably start to differentiate them more, but I just didn't really enjoy this album much. The production often makes the mix feel emptier than it actually is, where the vocals don't really fit production-wise, even though the singing is not bad at all. And it's just not very punchy, there's barely any tension, and it just sounds to me like alt-radio filler. I guess there are a few mostly redeeming moments, like The Wreckage, which has some nice riffs. Au revoir, Reservoir has some of the best vocals here. And Running Out of Sounds is kind of interesting, with what appears to be meta-commentary on writer's block, and recognizing that a lot of fans won't be happy regardless, and it's probably the best song on the album. I especially like the line, "And the stillness leaves me time to find a rhyme," which makes sense for this mellow track. But still, beyond that, there's not much I can say in the way of compliments. For me, it's a 5 out of 10, and really doesn't do that much to stand out to me in the grander scheme of things. And honestly, it might be the least I've liked a Silversun Pickups album. Alright, this is the last one in this video, the last album I'm talking about here. And I've never listened to a Rock Marciano album before this. I definitely heard his name, but hadn't really thought about him much, and according to those who are more in the know on underground hip-hop, it seems like he's a very important artist in the genre. And I saw this new album getting mostly positive reviews, so I decided to check it out. It didn't seem too complicated from what I was hearing, and it's also quite short. And not that there's anything wrong with complicated albums. In fact, that can often be a good thing, but this seemed fit for a mini review. And yeah, I get the hype. Although it does come with the acknowledgement that I'm bad at reviewing hip-hop albums, which is something I want to improve, and I think the best way to do that is by actually trying to review more of them, and I am well aware that there are details I might miss, and I'm okay with that. But I do really like a lot of the clever lines here, with what seems to be an overall sentiment of quiet luxury, something that he says multiple times on this album, which I'm pretty sure is at least partially about enjoying the small things in life without needing to show it off to everyone else, even though he absolutely has some braggadocious lines here. And while the rapping delivery was the main thing that held this back for me on my first couple of listens, now I feel like it makes sense to fit with the quiet themes, and it makes it even more funny when he says something absolutely ridiculous. There's a lot of exaggerated bars which give this album so much more personality. Rock Marciano also produced this album himself, and it sounds really good. It's got a very retro sound to it, and I think he owns this sound quite well here. And while I'm not familiar with the samples he used, I'm not even 100% sure there are a bunch of samples here, but a lot of them sound like it. I do think they were excellently chosen for these tracks. There are some bars here and there that leave me scratching my head, and despite what I was saying earlier about the reason I like the vocal delivery, and it even grew on me simply for the way it sounds too, I think it could have used a bit more variety, but it's still a great hip-hop album that I was not expecting, and a nice surprise early in the year. 8 out of 10 for me. It's hard to say how much or how little it'll stick with me throughout the year, but I'm impressed. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of these albums and or what you thought of my video. Again, it's all just my personal opinion. And also, yeah, once again, my voice definitely sounds not great because I'm sick. Maybe no one's even going to notice it, I don't know, but I felt like mentioning it anyway because, I don't know, to me, my voice sounds weird when I'm sick, but whatever. Anyway, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll be back with some more videos very soon.